Welcome to the One Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. Jacob, chapter 5. Chapter overview. This is a very lengthy chapter, 77 verses, but don't worry, we're not going to read them all. It primarily borrows from New Testament passages about olive trees and grapevines, but in doing so, it messes it up very horribly, badly. The basic analogy in this chapter is of God planting an olive tree, the Israelite nation, but it begins to decay. They were rebellious. So God took some of the branches from the tree, the Nephites and others of the lost tribes of Israel, and hid them around the vineyard, the world, saying it doesn't matter if the main stalk dies since the branches still live. But then also grafting in wild olive branches into the main stalk because it suddenly grieves God that he might lose the tree. Apparently, the wild branches are Gentiles becoming Christians, just like in Romans, and the analogy is a long apologetic for the Book of Mormon people even existing, unknown to the outside world. So there are many parallels between this analogy and what happens with the Book of Mormon people. If you're familiar with Jesus' parables about the vineyard, I am the vine, ye are the branches, and other such things, and with the Book of Romans, in which Paul likens the Israelites to an olive tree, a lot of this will probably sound familiar. There is talk of grafting in, of vineyards, of pruning, etc., etc. The main problem is that most, if not everything that is said in this chapter by way of analogy, is completely wrong. I have a lengthy article in the description for you to read it. I'm not going to read it out loud. Just go and see what all the problems are. It includes things like vineyards and olive trees needing different types of soil. Olive trees can grow in rocky, hard soil. Vineyards need good, fertile soil. So you just wouldn't go planting olive trees around your vineyard. You'd ruin both, or the olive trees wouldn't really grow well. Or if it's a place where the olive trees grow well, you wouldn't have vineyards there in the first place. Even more importantly, all the things that are said as happening to the olive trees by way of taking care of them are the exact opposite of what is actually done to promote the life and health of olive trees. The whole thing betrays an ignorance of how olive trees really are and what is good for them. These are the sort of mistakes that an ignorant upstate New York farm boy would make because he would have no knowledge of olive trees. They are not indigenous to the Americas. But these are not the sort of mistakes that the creator of olive trees and grapevines would make, which proves that this cannot be revelation from God. By way of contrast, when the Bible speaks of grapevines and olive trees and talks about doing things to them by way of analogy, these are exactly the sort of things that men would do for these plants. Looking more in depth at some of these verses, in verse 1 we are introduced to a prophet named Zenos. He's unknown outside the Book of Mormon. Don't waste your time looking for him in the Bible or anywhere else, with Jacob quoting him as an ancient prophet. Zenos seems to be brought in my opinion, as an excuse for Joseph Smith, Jacob, as an excuse for using the wild and tame olive trees in the Book of Romans. The Mormon might even claim that Paul must have been familiar with the writings of Zenos because he used the same analogy that Jacob here does. He would, of course, claim that those writings are now lost to us. I think one of the later Old Testament prophets does use an analogy of an olive tree, but it just is not a major Old Testament theme. So this would be unlikely for the Book of Mormon peoples to have used this since they supposedly separated from Judah in 600 BC. Also, since neither Jacob nor his fellows would have ever seen an olive or an olive tree, most likely, it makes it more incongruous to use this analogy since they would not be familiar with it. In verse 13, the Lord of the vineyards taking off some of the branches and hiding or putting them wherever he wants in the vineyard seems like it exists solely to justify the Book of Mormon claims that there were Book of Mormon people far removed from the land of Israel. Otherwise, it makes no sense for the branches to be hidden here and there rather than grafted into existing trees. Of course, if branches were actually cut off like that and just put in a vineyard somewhere, they would die. They wouldn't produce fruit. They would never grow. But existing trees, olive trees in a vineyard, can't exactly be hidden. So that makes no sense either. Verse 24 and others speak of multiple branches hidden all over. The Book of Mormon actually has several instances of this sort of thing, talking about other bands of Israelites who were scattered all over the world and lost. I think that originally the author of the Book of Mormon intended to write multiple books of these histories of the lost tribes of Israel. But since people took it as scripture and the Mormon religion started, that sort of consumed all of Joseph Smith's time, and he never got around to writing more. Verse 34 says, "And the servant said unto his master, Behold, because thou didst graft in the branches of the wild olive tree, they have nourished the roots, that they are alive, and they have not perished. Wherefore thou beholdest that they are yet good." The branches nourishing the roots. This reminds me that Jesus said that the branches don't support the root, the branches of a vine, of course, or the grapevine, but the vine or the root supports the branches. And so this is exactly the opposite of what we see in the Bible. Even though Jesus' parable of the branches and the root was of a grapevine, not an olive tree, it doesn't work any better for grapevines either. Branches never support the roots at all. I mean, yes, and obviously there is a mutually beneficial relationship between leaves and roots. They all work together for the health of the plant as an entirety. But we would never speak of branches supporting the roots. And in real trees, trees can last a long time with just the root, and they can eventually grow again, sprout leaves and grow again. So this analogy just doesn't really work. Further, this makes the roots into being the nation of Israel itself, with the branches that are broken off also being the nation of Israel that left the land one way or the other. But then what are the other branches if the root is the nation? It just gets muddled. It makes no sense. The breaking off and grafting in is obviously drawn from Romans. And if the grafting in of the wild branches is the Gentiles coming to believe in Jesus, as Romans says, then how does the root become bad and die? I guess this is an early statement in Mormonism about the supposed complete apostasy, so that Christianity becomes completely bankrupt, religiously and spiritually speaking, so that the grafting in of the natural branches that were broken off and planted elsewhere in the vineyard becomes the Lamanites, the American Indians, coming to believe in Jesus by way of Mormonism. But if the root is actually Jesus, then this is saying Jesus became bad and died. Verse 45 speaks of bad branches overcoming good ones, but how is this possible? This section reminds me of an overgrown analogy going bad to the point that it has overthrown reality and is now sitting in midair, completely unsupported. Verse 47 and the surrounding context is drawn from the Old Testament, and Jesus picks up on it in a couple of his analogies or parables. But the Old Testament is speaking of a fig tree or a vineyard, but not an olive tree, and as such, the analogy completely fails. Verse 69 says, "For behold, only this once will I prune my vineyard." This contradicts the Bible, which views pruning as a continuous, ongoing thing. Similarly, verse 71 says that this is the last time that God will nourish the vineyard, which is also weird and actually unbiblical, if you think about it, because the nourishment of the branches comes from the root, which is Jesus. So it's almost like saying that Jesus ceases to exist or ceases to nourish. But if that were to happen, then the branches would wither and die, which is said to be the equivalent of losing faith in Jesus or being cut off, etc. Verse 74 is just painful to read. It's convoluted and awkward. It's just weird. It's perhaps the worst sentence in English that I've ever read. "And thus they labored with all diligence, according to the commandments of the Lord of the vineyard, even until the bad had been cast away out of the vineyard. And the Lord had preserved unto himself that the trees had become again the natural fruit. And they became like unto one body, and the fruits were equal, and the Lord of the vineyard had preserved unto himself the natural fruit, which was most precious unto him from the beginning." Verse 76 just makes no sense. It's saying that God will, for a long time, lay up the fruit of my vineyard, not olive yard, for some odd reason, for the season which speedily cometh. So which is it? A long time or speedily?